Richard II, King of England and Royal Brat. Richard II was both an unfortunate king and a bad one at the same time. He was unfortunate because he became king as a young boy, without ever having had the chance to truly be mentored by a reigning king. Moreover, he became king just as his kingdom was facing earth-shaking events. It was all too much for a 10-year-old boy to face. He was given the reins of power while he was too young for it to be healthy. This seems to have led to Richard gaining an inflated opinion of himself and his own importance. It seems to have led to him developing something of a god complex, really. It was hard for him to gain an overinflated opinion of himself as king, but somehow Richard managed it. From the hope of England to the terror of his own people. From a future as bright as the sun to tyranny so harsh it would change the way England was ruled forever. This is the story of Richard II. Richard was born on January 6, 1367. He was born in the French town of Bordeaux during a period of time where much of the coast of France was in control of England. He was born into the period of time known as the 100 Years' War. His father, Edward the Black Prince, was the Crown Prince of England and the greatest knight in all of Europe. He had been a key figure in many of the biggest battles of the 100 Years' War up to this point, and was the Duke of the French region of Aquitaine. Richard's first several years are of little importance. He had an older brother who died 3 years into Richard's life, and so Richard became prince-in-waiting. It was generally hoped that Richard would have many years as crown prince to learn and grow up, as his father, the Black Prince, ruled over England, but alas, it was not to be. The Black Prince would become sick while on campaign against the French, and this sickness would slowly consume his life. The Black Prince's own father, King Edward III, was the man who started the 100 Years' War, and was, in his prime, a very great man and king. Unfortunately for Richard, King Edward had already lived and reigned a very long time before Richard was even born, 40 years in fact. By the time Richard was 8 years old, it was becoming clear that neither Edward III nor the Black Prince had much longer to live. Richard would have to grow up fast. In June of 1376, with young Richard being just 9 years old, Edward the Black Prince died from his illness. Richard was now next in line for the throne of England. A year later, in June of 1377, Edward III died of a stroke. Suddenly, Richard of Bordeaux was king-in-waiting at the age of just 10 years old. There was considerable debate among those in the English government as to whether Richard would be allowed to come to the throne peacefully or not. The Black Prince was not the only son of Edward III. Edward had 8 sons, 3 of whom would outlive their father. The oldest of these was John of Gaunt, 1st Duke of Lancaster. The Duchy of Lancaster was, at this point, the most powerful position in England next to the king. Gaunt had been Edward III's right-hand man as the old king slowly succumbed to old age. Gaunt was powerful, and as the eldest surviving son of the late king, he had a claim to the throne if he pushed for it. It would not have been the first time that the crown of England did not descend through the line of the eldest son. Fears that Gaunt wished to claim the crown and block his nephew from the throne were never realized. Gaunt seems to have never even considered taking the crown of England. He had been a loyal supporter of the old king, and a lifelong friend of Richard's father. Gaunt seems to have felt it his duty to ensure that Richard would come to the throne without issues. However, as with most of Richard's reign, it was not that simple. Gaunt may have been unswervingly loyal to Richard, but Richard was still a child. At the age of 10, he would hardly be expected to rule as king and make decisions of state. This left a question. Would there be a regency? There was already precedent for such a case. Henry III of England had also come to the throne as a child. His regent was the unswervingly loyal and honorable William the Marshal, a man of impeccable reputation. Was there such a man now in England? With the benefit of hindsight, it seems clear there was. Gaunt, throughout his life, would never once be proved to have betrayed Richard. However, when the young boy came to the throne, Gaunt was already too powerful for most of the nobles and people of Parliament to wish to see him gain more power. If Gaunt had been given the powers of regency, that combined with his own duchy would have been enough for him to simply take the crown for himself. And so Parliament decided on another form of government. A council of advisors would be picked from the nobles of the realm. They would act in the name of the king till such a time as Richard was ready to fully become king. This was a compromise that would keep Gaunt from gaining more power, but would still allow England to function as a nation. In an event organized and paid for by John of Gaunt, Richard II was crowned King of England on July 16th, 1377. As it was the first coronation in England in 50 years, it had to be a matter of special magnificence. And so it was. Richard was crowned in Westminster Abbey in a ceremony that included all three of his remaining uncles in prominent positions for the ceremony. The ceremony was celebrated long into the night, but young Richard was too young and too tired after his long day to enjoy it long. He was carried off to bed by his tutor and father figure, Sir Simon Burley. In this first ceremony of his reign, Richard showed no signs of what he would become later in life. He seems to have been patient throughout the long process it took to crown him. He swore the same coronation oath as his grandfather, and, in the end, showed something very natural for his age when he tired out after a long day. Richard does not seem to have been a huge factor in government till the year 1381. If you know anything about Richard II of England, you likely know this next part of his story. In 1381, discontent, which had been brewing among the peasants for many, many years, finally blew up into a full-scale revolt. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was a result of many complex and tangled issues, which would take hours to work out and explain. But here I will at least attempt to sum up. Early in the 100 Years' War, Edward III and the Black Prince had made considerable progress with conquests in France. So much so that they had control over a quarter of France. However, as Edward III aged and the Black Prince slowly succumbed to his illness, the English position in France fell apart. So much so that by 1381, there was very real fears of France invading England. There was also French pirates raiding the English coastlines. Fears of French pirates and a French invasion were bad enough, but then the government in London began raising taxes to fund an army to protect the coastline. This, in itself, was not bad. However, with all the taxes raised, the government was not able to protect the coastline. Being taxed is always unpopular. However, being taxed for a war that you are failing to win is one of the most unpopular reasons to tax someone. Moreover, there were 3 taxes levied within a couple of years. The second of these taxes was a scale-based tax, meaning you paid based on the amount of money you made rather than a flat rate. The first and third of these taxes, however, they were a flat rate, meaning that nobles and the rich paid the same amount of money as starving peasants who were barely able to survive. Whether this system was fair or not, the vast majority of the lower classes felt cheated, which caused even more discontent. While there were many reasons for the revolt, fear of an ineffective government letting France invade, combined with taxation, were the biggest reasons. In late May of 1381, the rebels began gathering in Kent and Essex. From there, they marched on London. Rather than overthrowing the young king, their plan was to remove the advisors who they believed had given the king bad advice. and were the cause of all their troubles. It was hoped, in fact, that Richard himself, when he heard their pleas, would become the leader of their cause. The rebel army arrived at London and demanded to be allowed inside. Many of the lower-class citizens of London, feeling their cause was the same as the rebels, rose with them, and the gates were thrown open for the rebels to enter. What followed was a scene from nightmares. Richard was rushed to the Tower of London to be protected. Many other lords took refuge there as well, including Richard's cousin, the young son of John of Gaunt, Henry Bolingbroke. There was a great debate among the advisors as to what should be done. Some thought that they should call those loyal to the king to rise and take back the city. However, it was eventually determined that negotiation was the best tactic, and so Richard agreed to meet the rebels at Greenwich. However, such a large crowd was gathered there that the advisors of Richard took fright and fled back to the tower with him. This enraged the rebels, who now demanded a meeting at Mile End. Richard went to this meeting and agreed to all the terms laid out by the rebels. However, while Richard was gone, the Tower of London was broken into, and a search was begun for anyone the rebels deemed a traitor. As John of Gaunt's palace outside of London had already been burned to the ground, there can be no doubt that his son, Henry, would have been on the list if found. However, he was hidden by a soldier who took pity on the poor boy, and the rebels never found him. How much history might have changed if not for Henry being hidden. However, there were more hidden in the tower than just Henry, and some of these included the Archbishop Simon Sudbury and Sir Robert Hales. I won't go into detail of the brutality here, but Archbishop Simon Sudbury, who was the Lord Chancellor of England, and Sir Robert Hales, who was the Lord High Treasurer, were both executed by the rebels for treason after they were dragged from the tower. It was believed by many of the rebels that these two men were responsible for all three of the taxations that had been levied on them in the past couple of years. Richard, and those advisors who went with him, did not return to the tower, but spent the night in an arms depot in the city. The next day, they would arm themselves and armor themselves in coats of mail. Then they would go and meet the rebel leaders again, this time at Smithfield on the outskirts of the city. The rebel leader, a butcher by the name of Wat Tyler, rode out from his army to speak to the king face to face. During this meeting, he would show no deference to his king, which would greatly anger the nobles with Richard. Tyler had a list of demands which amounted to a full-scale change in society. From the abolishment of most taxations to the end of all nobility. It amounted to a demand that all men would be equal under the lordship of the king alone, and that all goods would be held in common and distributed evenly throughout the land. In our minds, this sounds a lot like a communist system. However, in Tyler's own day and age, this sounded like lunacy. No one knows for sure what happened next. Some have claimed that Tyler, drunk on his own success, tried to attack either the king or one of his followers. Some claim that Richard, or a follower, struck at Tyler first. However, one thing that is certain is Tyler was stabbed with a dagger. He managed to ride his horse back to his rebels, but fell dead in front of them. The rebels now prepared to attack the king's party. At the same time, the mayor of London, who had put out a call the night before for loyal men to be ready to help the king if needed, rode off at top speed to gather a force. However, this would likely have not mattered if Richard had not committed what is likely the bravest act of his whole life. Spurring his horse forward, Richard cried in a loud voice, "Sirs, will you harm me? I am your captain and your king. Follow me, and I will lead you." In a stunning twist, the rebels did stop, and meekly submitted to Richard when the loyal troops surrounded them. A general pardon was issued to all those who had rebelled, and they were sent home. However, if they thought that Richard would adhere to any of the demands they had made that he agreed to, then they were sadly mistaken. Richard would dismantle all the concessions that he had given and would, by the end of his reign, push the country so far that most of the peasants simply watched as his reign collapsed. He had survived his first test as king. His next test would be marriage.